The Hong Kong Institute of Chartered Secretaries recently held its 11th biennial Corporate Governance Conference. In the conference's first session, the speakers are asked to give their views on the changing expectations for organizations, especially their being expected to deliver more than financial performance, and including issues relating to ESG performance, sustainability, and climate change responsibility. The first speaker to respond to this question is Mr. David Simmonds, Group General Counsel, Chief Administrative Officer, and Company Secretary of CLP Holdings Limited.
Well, the topic that I've been asked to address is whether financial performance is still the Holy Grail. Now, I plan to do that by looking at some of the big global drivers of change that are then causing a number of organisations around the world to re-evaluate whether financial performance is still indeed the Holy Grail. Unsurprisingly, most of the examples that I will give are from companies operating in Europe and North America. So I do plan to also look at the Hong Kong context and give my thoughts on what may prompt companies in Hong Kong to start giving greater focus to issues beyond short-term financial performance. And then I plan to briefly look at an example from my own organisation, CLP, to give an example in real terms of what we're doing in Hong Kong. So where did this notion of financial performance as the Holy Grail come from? Well, the notion or the debate about the role and purpose of a company is not new. It dates back hundreds of years. But the orthodox 20th century view of shareholder primacy became that expressed by Milton Friedman. And according to Friedman, the shareholder interest was paramount, and the thing that brought shareholder value, financial performance or profits, was indeed the Holy Grail. And on this view, the integrity of capitalism would be undermined if boards of companies took into account the interests of stakeholders other than shareholders. That was the purview of governments and regulators, and shareholders themselves could figure out what higher purposes they wish to follow using the dividends that they receive from the companies they invested in. Now, of course, since the time of Friedman, since he made that comment, we've seen that a singular focus on financial performance, even at the expense of the environment and society and employees, has led to financial scandals, a number of abuses, and it's also resulted in trust in business evaporating. But times are changing. There are a number of very big thematic drivers of change globally, which are causing a fundamental rethink about the focus on short-term financial performance. I think the transparency brought about by social media leaves very few places for companies to hide behaviours which are inconsistent with the values of the society in which they operate in. Technology developments will be a theme that's touched on later on in the conference, but in particular from my perspective, digitalisation and the power of machines to store, manage and learn from vast amounts of data is causing massive changes to business, where it comes to data protection, cyber security, the future of work, and disruption to established business models. They're changes that companies cannot ignore. Generational changes in climate change I'll come and talk about a little later. And in terms of social change, I don't think you have to look beyond the Me Too movement over the last 12 months to see the impact of changes in society. And the global financial crisis and the monetary policy that has been pursued following that has led to a widening wealth gap in society. So it is not hard, particularly when you combine that with technological developments, to see that expectations on business with respect to employment and wages will only get higher in the years ahead. So it seems pretty clear that what customers, governments and society at large expect of business today goes well beyond what was posited by Milton Friedman. And those big thematic drivers of change are driving more and more people to reevaluate the underlying role and purpose of the company and to reject the notion that short-term financial performance is the holy grail. And a good example of this is the B Corporation movement. B corporations go through a certification process that assesses their impact of the organisation on suppliers, on the environment and on society. And they're required to amend their governing documents to require boards to have regard to the broader range of stakeholders and to balance profit and purpose. And there are now more than 2,600 of these B corporations across 60 countries around the world, including some pretty well-known brands like Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And I think the underlying philosophy is well summed up by the Patagonia CEO when she says that business impacts and serves more than just shareholders. It has an equal responsibility to the community and to the planet. Now, this isn't just small and medium-sized companies that are taking this approach either. We've seen multinationals like Unilever, who own Ben & Jerry's, take a very strong approach on ESG. And Danone, who is a global food company listed on the Paris Stock Exchange with a market capitalization of around $50 billion US, has taken the step of pledging that all its group subsidiaries will become registered as B corporations within the next few years. And you've even seen the CEO of Danone, who's quoted up there on the slide, saying that the purpose of the firm is not to create shareholder value. It's to get healthy food to as many people as possible. So why have they taken that approach? Well, it's not just because they want to feel good. They view it as good for business. And it's because, in large part, due to generational changes brought about by the rise of the purchasing power of millennials. Millennials have a very different view of big corporations than generations that have gone before, and they're actively rejecting a number of brands that their parents would have used for years before. They prefer to shop locally and buy from smaller producers. And Danone's hope is that by doing away with the notion of financial performance as the Holy Grail, and by focusing on a higher purpose, both in their words and in their actions, they can rebuild trust and patronage for the brand. With apologies to Prue, Larry Fink's letter no doubt will get lots of mentions throughout this conference. But turning to asset managers, and I noticed that BlackRock's assets under management has increased dramatically. I think Larry Fink takes the time to write letters to CEOs. The last one that he wrote at the end of last year exhorted CEOs to take a long-term view and to consider a range of stakeholders beyond that of narrow shareholder interest. And the letter is essentially advocating a stakeholder-inclusive view of corporate governance, rather than a shareholder-centric one, and it has attracted a huge amount of attention globally. And BlackRock are not taking this approach because they've developed a social conscience with other people's money. I think they're taking it fundamentally because they believe that it is good for business. Now, in addition to business and asset managers like BlackRock, regulators are also paying attention to these issues increasingly. We've seen in South Africa, led by Professor Mervyn King, the King reports recommending integrated reporting and a stakeholder-inclusive model for corporate governance. In the UK, we've seen reforms continue directed at requiring companies to have regard to interests beyond those of shareholders and to be transparent about how those interests are taken into account. And even in the home of Milton Friedman in the US, we've recently seen moves to rethink the notion of shareholder primacy. And Senator Warren, who is reportedly planning to run as a Democratic nominee for the next presidential elections, last month proposed an Accountable Capitalism Act, which, among other things, advocates a shift to a stakeholder-inclusive model of governance. So we have a number of businesses, large asset managers and regulators all advocating for change. So it would give the impression that we've moved well beyond financial performance as the Holy Grail. And then we come to Hong Kong. The Hong Kong context can seem somewhat removed from this line of thinking. And while greater regard is being had to ESG, I think financial performance remains firmly the paramount driver for companies in Hong Kong. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, actually. And as Andrew will no doubt touch on in the next session, KPMG with the Hong Kong Institute of Chartered Secretaries in some research on ESG, which CLP supported, found that most respondents in Hong Kong recognised the value in focusing on ESG, but there was still a fairly large gap between those supportive words and the actual action on the ground. And for boards and management of companies in Hong Kong, directors' duties are often raised as an obstacle to change in this area. And in Hong Kong, directors' duties are still firmly anchored in the notion that the interests of the company equate with the interests of shareholders. And you don't have to look too far beyond the company's registry guide to directors' duties to see that spelt out in pretty clear terms. So for many people, it remains debatable the extent to which the interests of other stakeholders can be legitimately taken into account, particularly if there's no derivative benefit for shareholders. So how do we reconcile this? And how might boards in Hong Kong and elsewhere be encouraged to take into account a wider set of interests beyond financial performance? Well, for me, I don't think it's by downplaying the importance of financial performance or the importance of shareholders. After all, the power to appoint and remove the board rests with the shareholders. And it's fairly self-evident, I think, that the ability for companies to contribute to society in no small measure depends on its ability to generate profit sustainably over the long term. So whilst financial performance does remain a critical motivator, I think the notion of enlightened self-interest could help. In other words, that having regard to the legitimate interests of stakeholders beyond shareholders is important because it is essential for the long-term sustainability for a business. And when you look at Larry Fink's letter by way of an example, I think this is essentially what he's asking of the companies that BlackRock invest in. And that first requires a rejection of short-termism. And here the evidence is mounting that short-termism destroys value. Notable among the many that have spoken out on this topic is the op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year by James Dimon, who is the head of JP Morgan, and Warren Buffett, who earlier this year were urging companies to end the practice of giving quarterly earnings guidance. They argue that it encourages an unhealthy focus on short-term profits at the expense of long-term growth and economic strength. But it's not just anecdotal. FCLT Global is a not-profit organisation that encourages a longer-term focus for business. And their 2007 publication that's pictured on the screen is well worth a read. It summarises a raft of research that finds pretty clearly that a focus on short-term performance causes long-term harm to organisations, including a range of Harvard University studies that show that companies that exhibit short-term behaviours tend to have higher costs of capital and more volatility in their share price. In contrast to short-termism, the benefits of taking a long-term approach are well documented in the McKinsey study from last year, which I've also shown on the screen. That study found that long-term focused companies have stronger fundamentals, deliver superior financial performance, continue to invest in difficult times, and add more to economic output and growth. And once focus transfers to the long term, a much broader range of matters and interests fall naturally for consideration. Over the long term, the bona fide interests of all stakeholders tend to align, and I think that helps address the directors' duties issues that I mentioned earlier, even without any further regulatory change. But a rejection of short-termism in favour of the long term only takes us so far. A company tends to do best when it has a motivating purpose which goes beyond short-term profits. People want to work for, buy from, and invest in companies and businesses that they trust and believe in. And increasingly, the converse is true. People are actively rejecting companies who they do not trust or believe in, and companies that have continued to have a focus on profits at the expense of those other stakeholders are actively being rejected. So I think there are obvious benefits to companies for having a clear motivating purpose which considers not only shareholders but also a company's place in society and its impact on its employees, customers and society in general. And that's not surprising when you consider that almost every business around the world is subject to disruption from those big thematic drivers of change that I mentioned earlier. So now I'll just turn quickly to an example from my own company, CLP, who probably doesn't need much introduction for the audience, so I'll just skip through to the specific example of climate change, which is one of those big drivers of change affecting businesses almost everywhere. And CLP as a power company is at the pointy end of this challenge because the power sector accounts for around 40% of global carbon emissions from the energy sector. So there's no solution to climate change that doesn't involve the power sector. And at the same time, governments and communities expect that they will continue to be able to enjoy a power supply which is both reliable and affordable, which are two objectives that can sometimes conflict with climate change solutions. And at CLP, we take the view that this is a problem that should be solved by this generation and not left for the next, and we have an obligation to proactively address these issues. And our Climate Vision 2050 document, which was first published in 2007, has been our answer to these questions. It included a range of commitments to change the way that we conduct our business over time in order to transition to a low-carbon business. And as part of this, we included a number of targets for the build-out of renewable energy and low-carbon generation, and we set ourselves voluntary carbon intensity targets. And we did all of this well ahead of other power companies. And last year, following the momentum with the ratification of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we reviewed those targets and decided to further strengthen them. And the main objectives of our Climate Vision 2050 are to set in place targets which we believe are an appropriate contribution to the challenge faced by the entire global community, and to help guide our business expansion in a way that will help minimise the impact of these changes on our business. So our Climate Vision 2050 has played a really important part in guiding us into new technologies, particularly renewable energy and storage, even when those investments carried a lower return. And through this approach, we've developed skills that are helping us manage the changes that are happening in our industry and to meet the expectations of the communities and societies in which we operate. So in our view, this is a change which is not only the right thing to do for the environment and the communities in which we operate, it's also good business. To sum up, in my view, long-term sustainable financial performance is the Holy Grail, and that requires a strategy for long-term value creation and a motivating purpose for the company that goes beyond simply making money. To achieve that demands that regard is had to a wide range of stakeholders and the impact of business decisions on those stakeholders, beyond just shareholders, and how the company takes its place in the societies and communities in which it operates. Thank you.
The second speaker is Mr. Andrew Weir, Regional Senior Partner of Hong Kong and Vice Chairman of KPMG China. He too is asked to comment on the changing expectations for organizations. In his presentation, he stresses the need for change.
The need for change. I had a very interesting strategy session with the head of a major local bank. I won't give its name, but it starts with Hong Kong. And 50% of the 1 hour presentation by the head was about culture, conduct, and character. Profit wasn't mentioned. Broader strategic themes weren't mentioned. It all came back to this. And I think this is the world we're in. You look at all the major regulators, just in Hong Kong alone, the HKMA has brought out the concept of culture, how important it is, how it can be measured. The SSC has responsible business practices. The stock exchange has its own as well, and it's expanding the role of directors. This is the direction of travel, and I think a lot of people haven't realized it. The direction of travel is, as an organization, do you have social license to operate? Do you have that social contract? This is very, very different. These are the rules, compliance by the letter. This is a way of thinking. And I just put up there some of the words and themes which come up in this thinking. Trust and quality being paramount. I run KPMG here, as you know. You pick up the newspaper, it's a bit of an open season on the Big Four globally. We're having probably more than our fair share. A lot of it, to be quite frank, is not true. Doesn't matter. It's all about trust and quality. And the profession I'm in is being challenged on exactly that. But this trust and quality is something which has moved away from being very waffly and esoteric into something very, very fundamental. Trust, absolutely key. So this responsible business and what it all means for company secretaries, chartered secretaries and professionals, it totally raises the bar on what we need to bring to the table. It's been a recurring theme I've raised each year. In Hong Kong, our legal counsel and company secretaries at the top table. CLP, Weir, Cathay, good examples. How common is that? Is the service provided, seen as back office, not at board level? If it is, let's get out there and challenge it. There's a whole amount of things which are now boardroom issues. And having the Chartered Secretary at the forefront of the governance debate, challenging the board, is absolutely paramount. So I really feel it's something we really need to look at in Hong Kong. So conduct, character, and culture. Another theme we're seeing out there is interconnectivity of risks. A massive shot in the arm for the whole concept of ESG has been an excellent World Economic Forum Global Risk Survey, where for the first time, the linkages of broader societal risks, environmental risks, back into the business has been done. For far too long, a lot of these concepts we talk about, it could be everything from diversity to ESG, have been seen almost as single issues or lobbying issues by particular organizations, often with a particular subset at the forefront. What this map shows, and it's in your material, is the interconnectivity. How quickly profound social instability, how quickly failure of regional and global structures, how quickly climate change and environmental factors can give rise to major business issues. And this interconnectivity of risks, I think, informs the idea that we've got to have a much more holistic approach to governance and what it means. We did a publication last year. I think the interesting thing here is the most important point selected as a priority on the board agenda, and excuse me as I take my glasses off, was to develop long-term value creation and the company's role in society. The context for corporate performance is changing, and consideration of a corporation's role in society is moving from the periphery to the center of corporate thinking. That was number one in our global survey on what is top of the board agenda. The second one is connecting strategy and risk. And as I said earlier, this more holistic approach to risk is bringing some of these issues seen as peripheral before into the core. But this also informs the general discussion about what is the purpose of the company, what is the culture. The reality is, these days we are constantly recruiting our people on a daily basis. They've got to feel a sense of purpose. So it is fundamental to that. So we've got to have a purpose and a culture, but one of the laziest expressions in governance is tone at the top. I know many boards of excellent people, and it's not a good board. I know many organizations with very good tone at the top, and it stays at the top. Fair question, if you're a company secretary, if you're a director, how do you get comfort what the tone for the organization is? I don't want to be glib, but what is tone at the middle and what's tone at the bottom? And if you're sitting on a board or you're a company secretary, you have good quality presentations on a management-led agenda, no one will ever know. So, fair question, rhetorical question. What is the culture? How is it exemplified? Is it at risk? It's fluid. 3 years ago, if you'd asked me to name one of the leading organisations best in class in corporate governance, I would have said Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Well, we all know what's happened there. It's all been looked at, it's been analysed. If you look at that report, it's a wake-up call for any company secretary or board director. The knock-on effect of that in the business community is enormous, and there's another major bank in Australia who've just appointed a total outsider, Prue, you know this, a total outsider as the chief executive. What was the one criteria they wanted? Humility, which I thought was very, very interesting. The ability to listen and see one isn't always right. And that will regain the trust back with the organisations. So we've done a report. We were delighted to support Mohan's idea. It's always a good idea to agree with Mohan. He's twice the size of me and he's a very persuasive man. But Mohan came up with this idea and we're delighted to come together with CLP. Let's be very clear, CLP and KPMG are doing it because we believe in it. We don't see this as sort of a massive generator of income for all the cynics in the room. It's the right thing to do. Now, what's interesting, we had over 200 people replied to the survey on ESG. And let me share with you the reaction. I think the good news is there's less cynicism than before. There's much more recognition that this is more integral to the business. It's not a pet lobby topic, but there's a long way to go in practice. Let me just share with you. And again, sorry, the glasses are coming off. I've hit that stage in life. 88% of the respondents believe ESG is relevant. That is a massive improvement from when initially the stock exchange launched stage one. That's a massive improvement. Let me just read it out to you because the slides are a bit small to read. 38% see ESG as an essential part of a business because of a business's dependence on environmental and social resources for success. 30% see ESG as having value to attract investors seeking long-term sustainable value on their investments, and so is good for business. So an element of vested interest. 18% see it as a public relations marketing issue that enhances the organization's reputation. So when you add all that up, you get to 88% seeing it as relevant. So this is good. This is a positive direction of travel. Where it gets harder is when you look at implementation. The question was ways in which ESG has been integrated into core business processes. It deliberately doesn't add up to 100% because people tick which ones they think are relevant. But 43% said policies and risk management systems now incorporate ESG. That's not bad. ESG considered in boardroom discussions, 41%. Initial thinking is not bad, but when you say less than half of the boards are considering ESG at board level, that's a major concern and shows we all have a lot of work to do. 41% said ESG key performance indicators are used to track performance. 37% say it's integrated into strategic planning. Only 28% have ESG requirements on suppliers, which is probably the quickest win one can do. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd suggest that shows there's a long way to go. It shows there's an appetite, but in terms of implementation, it's got a long way to go. And unfortunately, there's a school of thought which is developing in Hong Kong, and I'm finding I'm increasingly starting to see it that way, that in the absence of more regulation and more requirement, one doesn't move the dial quick enough, be it in diversity or be it on this. And where do people think they are in integrating ESG into their business? I think the best way to describe it is the holy grail, to use David's expression, is stage 5. Using a ESG to achieve a leading position in driving a purposeful business. And at the bottom is stage 1, increasing key stakeholders' awareness of ESG. And between that, there's a whole range of outcomes. The analysis we did with Mohan and with David is that Hong Kong largely is sitting between stage 2 and stage 3. Halfway between complying with ESG regulations and managing reputational risk and actually bringing it properly into business operation. The board involvement is a concern. I've been involved with a number of boards, and to be frank, most of our involvement is looking at the annual ESG report and questioning a few things. But this is something we've got to get to the next level. It goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of what the expectation is, the world we're in now. Boards have to be all over this topic. So board tracking of the issue is important. Having a board as a whole considering ESG as a strategic issue, only 25% are doing that. Adding board members with specific ESG-related skills and experience, only 13% have that, or have it on the to-do list. I won't go through it all in detail, but you can see the direction of travel. Progress made, but getting to that next level of making it genuine and embedded is the challenge. Hong Kong has an institutional challenge in facing up to a key word, which is called complacency. And when you look at Hong Kong's positioning with regard to its ESG reporting, Hong Kong is number 24 in the world, according to Corporate Knights survey. It's not surprising that the Nordic countries and probably the more enlightened countries in the environmental space are at the top. But the Hong Kong rating is a composite of many things. The one which keeps Hong Kong as high as 24 is that actually we're pretty timely. So to cut a long story short, we're saying not very much, but quite quickly we're saying it because of the requirement to report in a certain time. I think as Hong Kong is an international finance center, that is a very worrying league table. There's a couple of other trends I just want to share with you, which is why I think this direction of travel is irrefutable. It's the growth in the sustainable investment market. In the West, this is such a hot topic. It's a massive issue in the EU. Organizations like BlackRock, Fidelity, Aviva, and others are driving forces on it. But let me just show you the scale of what's called the sustainable investment market. That basically is the market of investment in assets where sustainability and ESG lens is brought to bear. According to this survey, and it's about to be updated, 25% of global assets under management now qualify for the sustainable investment market. And that size of the market itself is $23 trillion US. This shows the scale of the issue. And what we haven't woken up to in Asia is that this is coming. This is a massive driving force in how investors are going to look at companies and deploy capital. Now, you may look at it and you see, it's interesting the different themes. I'll leave you to look at it. It's interesting the different regional cuts. But the Japanese major investment fund in Japan shifted $1 trillion of asset under management into the sustainable investment pot and moved the dial. And that's just one organization. And this is coming. And it's interesting, the enlightened people in this corporate governance space are seeing this as probably the biggest driving force. This will drive exchanges, it will drive regulations, it will drive behavior. But I don't think we've really woken up and smelt the coffee in Hong Kong on this. Another important area is this. The Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Task Force. This is part of a financial stability board chaired by Michael Bloomberg. And then you see Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney there. CLP, a lot of the banks and others are signatories to this. This is very interesting. It's not what the recommendations are, it's what the ramifications of them will be. The recommendations are actually about disclosures, financial disclosures. The ramifications are the organizations who signed up for it will be reviewing, if you're a major bank, and some of the major banks in town are signatories, they'll be reviewing their assets for embedded climate change issues and risks. And then this will give rise to an assessment of them. And as I mentioned earlier, this concept of stranded assets is going to be a major issue. And Ashley Alder, the SFC chief executive, has been watching this very closely. I know the HKMA is, because one is going to find the coalescing of the ESG lobby, the financial disclosures lobby, giving rise to assets which will be defined as near-on toxic. And these are currently sitting in balance sheets. So I'm not trying to worry people too much, but I'm just trying to show what's happening outside Hong Kong. These are massive forces which are driving it forward. So, really, I think it's pretty clear where I'm coming from. We're all professionals. We're all committed to governance. The concept of governance is changing. Our challenge is to raise the bar. And in Hong Kong, being incremental is almost as bad as being complacent. We need a step change, a quantum change in the expectations we set on what good governance means, and a rallying around of all the regulators, all the professional organizations, so that the topic of today, the new horizon, the new values, the new responsibilities, is really brought to life here. Thank you very much.